In this video, I'm going to talk about how to brainwash your leads with podcast interviews. Now, the biggest mistake that I see when business owners go appear as a guest on other people's podcasts is they just think it's another PR tour. It's great for marketing or exposure or awareness. All of these terms that, quite frankly, I hate because they're so oversaturated and nobody actually knows what they mean anymore. The thing that most business owners do not understand is the power of propaganda. In other words, how you can strategically deploy you being a guest on podcast and the content that comes from that podcast within your sales process in order to increase your show rate, your close rate, which is ultimately going to drive down your ad cost and make you more profitable as a business owner. So in this video, I am going to walk you through step by step the psychology behind why this is going to help your sales process and why you being a guest on other people's podcasts that are in your industry that have your ideal clients is the number one thing that you can do to scale your business faster in not only today's age, but into the future. Now, of course, being a guest on podcasts is great for exposure and awareness, but what people do not understand is that it's the number one thing that you can incorporate within your sales process that's going to dramatically increase all of the key statistics inside of your business that you want increased, while also decreasing all of those statistics that you want decreased within your business, like your ad cost, etc. But all of this cannot be understood unless you understand what we call mental models. Now, how I define a mental model is simply the collection of somebody's thoughts, beliefs, and feelings towards a topic or towards someone that's based on their past experiences. Now, the reason why I bring this up is because in today's modern marketplace, people are more sophisticated than ever before. And more importantly, people are more skeptical of bad actors than ever before. So what's ending up happening is that a lot of people are continuing to adapt the same marketing principles that have got them here, but they're failing to understand that it's the thing that's going to get them there. In other words, most people are just doing the typical direct response marketing and just driving people to their sales event, whether that be a webinar, challenge, sales call, doesn't matter. And they're just driving as many people there and focusing on how do I get as many people to sign up for that sales event as humanly possible. But what's ended up happening is over the past years, business owners are experiencing lower show rates than ever before. It's harder and harder to close, especially on the first call if you sell something expensive. And not only that, but cash collection percentages have gone down where now business owners are collecting less cash up front, which means they have less cash to deploy in the business to be able to scale faster. And the reason for all of this is because marketers are not focusing and business owners are not focusing on mental models. Because what's happened is people have been so traumatized by all of the bad experiences that they've had in the past by other marketers who promoted their product or service that they deploy that belief based on their past experience onto you and your business on a subconscious level. And that's why people aren't even showing up to sales calls in the first place or to any other sales event, is because subconsciously, without them even realizing it, they just think it's going to end up like the same experience they had in the past. So therefore, they don't deem it valuable enough to show up to. But I just want you to think about for a minute, one of your favorite influencers, if they invited you onto a sales call with their team, would you doubt showing up? Would you think it's not valuable enough? Of course not. And the reason for that is because they understand mental models. But more importantly, they understand how to construct the mental narrative that is needed in order to get you to show up to their sales call or their sales event, but not just show up, but to be in the mental state of buying. And that's the thing, is when you understand mental models, you understand that in today's modern marketplace, it's not just about getting people to show up to the sales event. It's about getting them to show up to the sales event well framed and specifically with the thoughts, feelings, and beliefs that are most aligned with the action that you want them to take. Why? Because I know I do at least, and hopefully you, genuinely believe that you getting somebody to buy something that you sell is the best thing that you could possibly do for that person. But if you do not do what is required of you and shape and mold and carefully orchestrate the mental narrative of that person prior to them attending your sales event, they are going to simply bring all of the baggage from their past and dump it all onto you, and you are not going to be able to help as many people as you could. And ultimately, this is where you being a guest on podcast allows you to literally brainwash and plant the seeds of the ideas, thoughts, and feelings that are needed from a prospect in order to buy your product or service. Now, here's the caveat. What I'm not saying is just go on podcast and blabber. Of course not. With our clients here at podcastguest.io, we walk them through what we call the 4 quadrants of content, which we'll cover in another video, showing you exactly how to deploy what I'm about to talk about. But the power is when you're going on podcast and you're exposing people to who you are prior to them even entering your sales process, what that does is, number one, it triggers the familiarity bias, where people inherently trust people more that are familiar to them. In other words, the more that people see you, the more they inherently trust you. But the biggest thing when it comes to being a guest on podcast is that when you appear as a guest on a show, you are doing it in a way which is low barrier to entry. The biggest problem people have is that in order to make a $10,000, $20,000, I like selling expensive stuff, $30,000 purchasing decision, it requires a very high level of psychological safety, where on a subconscious level, these people are asking themselves, is this somebody that I can trust? Do I believe with as much certainty as possible that I am going to get the result? But what ends up happening is that when they enter your sales process, they have such limited context on who you are, that's what's required is for them to go off and do an increased amount of due diligence, where now people are needing to be more educated than ever before making a purchasing decision. But what happens is when you appear as a guest on somebody else's podcast, number one, the trust that the audience has with the host is immediately placed onto you. So now you're no longer a stranger, especially to the people that are viewers of that podcast. You're a trusted authority because you were trusted enough by the podcast host to come onto the podcast. But the second and most important reason is that when you go on a podcast as a guest, you have 60 to 90 minutes to demonstrate the value of what you have before you ever ask for a dollar from your prospect. And what that does on a subconscious level, it gets a person to see that what you do is valuable before you ever ask them for a large commitment. So what happens now is that if you do this in the right way and you're able to share your story and craft your talking points and implement the 4 quadrants of content, you're able to answer the questions that your ideal clients have, you're able to overcome the myths and misconceptions they have, you're able to overcome their objections, and you're able to set expectations of who you work with and who you don't work with. What ends up happening is that you are educating your prospects before they ever enter your sales process. Now, one key tip is that if you have a sales team, one of the best things you can do is you can leverage your podcast appearances with your sales team. A simple trick is just have them send it out to the people that are on their calendar 1 or 2 days before the call and say, hey, the business owner wanted me to personally send this to you. They thought that this would be valuable based upon what you put on the application. Now, what's happening? Well, when you're able to incorporate a lot of the things that we're talking about in this video, what ends up happening is you are literally planting into the mind of that prospect the thoughts, feelings, and beliefs that they need to have in order for them to have the highest likelihood of taking action on your offer. So hopefully you're starting to see how on one end, we leave the due diligence process completely up to the prospect, where we just leave it up to them to think however they want to think, come with any thoughts that they've had, and ultimately go off and do a bunch of research and hopefully be educated, and then they'll book a follow-up call that they never show up to. You get what I'm trying to say. But on the other end, what we're doing is we're controlling that due diligence process, where we are giving that prospect the information and we are educating them by showing up on podcasts that are coming up on their Spotify feeds, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, etc. So now, number one, they're becoming more familiar with us, which is going to automatically increase the level of trust they have. Now we're demonstrating the value of what we do before we ever ask them for a large commitment. But most importantly, number 3, when done in the right way, you are strategically planting the thoughts, feelings, and beliefs that are needed in order for that person to not just show up to your sales event, but to be framed in the way that you need them to be in order to make a buying decision. And that's ultimately what this is all about, is you being a guest on podcast allows you to put content out there that is long form, genuine, and authentic, that is going to influence the way that people not just show up, but act when they show up. We have clients all at a time where they start implementing these strategies, going on podcasts, deploying them into their sales process, like some of the things that I've told you in this video. And what ends up happening is their prospects consistently mention, I saw you on this podcast, I saw you on that podcast. And every single time, what ends up happening is it is a lay down lead more times than not. Of course, there's going to be some that are not, but what ends up happening is there's so much trust built before the sales event that they're already pre-sold on working with you. Now it's just time to figure out the logistics. Now, to bring this back to the top, you being on podcast is going to allow you to orchestrate a mental narrative within your prospect that is advantageous with your sales process. And we're not doing this because we just want to make as much money as possible. Yes, we do. But we know that the money we make is a direct reflection of the value that we're creating in other people's lives. So instead of just allowing people to just do their education on their own behalf or do their due diligence on their own time, we are going to provide so much value to people in the form of our podcast appearances. We're going to apply the 4 quadrants of content, which we will cover in another video. And we're going to educate people either before they enter our sales process so that by the time they do, they're already pre-sold, or we strategically deploy these podcasts within our sales process to leads that came from maybe an ad, a cold email, another channel, but we still have them pre-framed to the sales call or the sales event because of how we're deploying the podcast and the content from that podcast in our sales process with our sales team, etc. So hopefully this makes sense. It's the number one thing that you can do, especially in today's age where people are more skeptical than ever, to be able to shape the mental narrative and to mold it into the mental model that is most aligned with the desired outcome. Because ultimately, we know that that's what's best for the client.